In the winter of 1847, a doctor in Victorian London made a discovery in his basement that would haunt his bloodline for 6 generations. What he found wasn't supposed to exist. What he did with it was never supposed to be spoken about. And what his family became because of it should terrify you to your core. Because the Fentons didn't just study death, they worshipped it. They preserved it, they became it. And somewhere, in a locked room that still exists today, their final experiment waits in the darkness, breathing without lungs, watching without eyes, calling out to the last surviving Fenton with a voice that sounds exactly like their own. This is the story they buried beneath lies, medical records, and unmarked graves. This is the macabre history of the Fenton family, and by the end of this story, you'll understand why some obsessions don't just destroy families, they transform them into something that should never have existed in the first place. Dr. Cornelius Fenton was not a monster when he began. He was a respected physician in London's Whitechapel district, known for his compassionate treatment of the poor and his brilliant understanding of human anatomy. His colleagues at the Royal College of Surgeons praised his meticulous documentation, his steady hands during surgery, and his almost supernatural ability to diagnose ailments that baffled other doctors. But what they didn't know, what nobody could have known, was that Cornelius had been searching for something since childhood, an answer to a question that consumed him every waking moment and invaded his dreams with grotesque imagery and whispered promises. The question was simple, terrifying, and utterly human. What happens to consciousness in the exact moment between life and death? Not after death, not during life, but in that microsecond of transition when the soul supposedly departs and the body begins its journey toward decay. Cornelius believed that in that infinitesimal moment, something magnificent occurred, something that, if captured and understood, could unlock secrets that had eluded humanity since the dawn of consciousness itself. He had read every text, every philosophical treatise, every forbidden manuscript smuggled out of monastery libraries and occult societies, and they all pointed to the same terrifying conclusion. The moment of death was not an ending, but a doorway, and on the other side of that doorway was something that wanted desperately to communicate with the living, something that had been trying to speak for millennia, waiting for someone with the courage and the madness to listen. The first experiment happened by accident, though Cornelius would later claim it was fate, destiny, or something darker that guided his hand that December night. A young woman, barely 20 years old, had been brought to his surgery after a factory accident. Her name was Elizabeth Marsh, and she had perhaps an hour to live. Her injuries were catastrophic, internal bleeding that no surgeon in 1847 could hope to stop. Cornelius held her hand as she died, and in those final moments he watched her eyes with an intensity that would have disturbed anyone who witnessed it. He wasn't offering comfort, he was studying, observing, recording every microsecond of her transition from life to death. And then he saw it. Just before her final breath, her pupils dilated in a way that defied normal physiological response. For a fraction of a second, they didn't just dilate, they changed. The black expanded beyond the iris, consuming the white of her eyes entirely. And in that darkness, Cornelius swore he saw something looking back at him. Not Elizabeth, not death, but something else, something aware,
something that recognized him and mocked him in a way he couldn't explain. When her body finally went still, Cornelius sat in silence for 3 hours, his hand still clutching hers, his mind racing with possibilities that terrified and exhilarated him in equal measure. He had glimpsed something beyond the veil, and it had glimpsed him in return. From that moment forward, Cornelius Fenton was no longer a doctor. He was a seeker of forbidden knowledge, and his family's fate was sealed. The basement laboratory came next. Cornelius convinced his wife, Margaret, that he needed additional space for medical research, and she, trusting and devoted, never questioned why he spent entire nights below the house, or why strange chemical odors seeped through the floorboards, or why he began requesting that family members never, under any circumstances, enter the basement without his explicit permission. What Margaret didn't know was that Cornelius had begun collecting specimens, bodies from the morgue, obtained through connections with corrupt officials, parts from dissection rooms, and, most disturbingly, living subjects in their final moments, people he convinced to spend their last hours in his care under the promise of comfort and dignity. But dignity was the last thing these poor souls received. Cornelius had developed a technique, crude by modern standards, but ingenious for its time, that involved a series of chemical injections administered in precise sequence as death approached. These compounds, derived from alkaloids, mercury, and substances he never fully documented, were designed to preserve the brain tissue at the exact moment of death, crystallizing the neural pathways in their final firing pattern. He believed that consciousness, that spark of awareness, was not metaphysical but physical, encoded in the precise electrical and chemical state of the brain at the moment of transition. If he could preserve that state, he could study it, understand it, and perhaps, in his most grandiose and terrifying ambition, replicate it. His journals from this period reveal a man descending into obsession, his handwriting becoming more erratic, his thoughts more fragmented, his language shifting from scientific observation to something approaching religious ecstasy.
Margaret discovered the truth in 1851, 4 years into Cornelius's dark experiments. She had descended to the basement to retrieve her husband for dinner, and found him standing before a table lined with glass jars, each containing a human brain suspended in yellowish fluid. But it wasn't the specimens that made her scream. It was the fact that several of the brains were moving. Not floating, moving, pulsing with rhythmic contractions that mimicked breathing, twitching in patterns that seemed almost purposeful. And most horrifying of all, one of the jars was connected by thin copper wires to a primitive battery apparatus, and the brain inside was glowing with a faint, phosphorescent light that pulsed in time with Margaret's own heartbeat, as if it could sense her presence, as if it recognized her. Cornelius tried to explain, his words tumbling out in a desperate cascade of scientific terminology and philosophical justification. He told her about the threshold moment, about the consciousness that persisted beyond death, about the magnificent discovery that would change humanity's understanding of existence itself. But Margaret heard none of it. She heard only the humming of the electrical apparatus, and what she swore was a sound coming from the jars, a high-pitched keening that wasn't audible but felt, vibrating through her bones and resonating in the hollow spaces of her skull. She fled the basement and locked herself in their bedroom for 2 days, refusing food, refusing to speak to Cornelius, clutching their infant son and praying for deliverance from whatever demon had possessed her husband. But Margaret didn't leave. This is the part of the story that reveals the true horror of the Fenton lunacy, because the obsession wasn't just Cornelius's disease, it was contagious. Over the following weeks, Margaret found herself drawn back to the basement door, listening to the sounds below, imagining what her husband was discovering in those long, isolated hours. She began reading his journals when he slept, and though the contents should have repulsed her, she found herself fascinated by the implications, seduced by the possibility that death might not be the absolute ending that religion and society promised. Her own mother had died 2 years earlier, and the grief still consumed her. The thought that consciousness might persist, that some essential spark of her mother might still exist somewhere, in some form, was too tempting to resist. Within 6 months, Margaret had become Cornelius's assistant, helping him obtain specimens, recording observations, and developing her own theories about the nature of consciousness and death. Their son, Edmund, grew up in a house where death was not feared but studied, where the boundary between scientific inquiry and occult practice blurred into something unrecognizable. By the time Edmund was 7 years old, he had witnessed more human dissections than most medical students, and he had begun asking questions that chilled even his parents. Questions about whether the preserved brains could think, whether they dreamed, whether they suffered in their glass prisons. And Cornelius, instead of shielding his son from these horrors, encouraged the curiosity, recognizing in Edmund the same burning obsession that had consumed his own life. The breakthrough came in 1856, and it was Edmund, age 13, who made the critical observation that would push the family's experiments into territory that transcended science and entered the realm of the truly profane. He had been studying one of the preserved specimens, a brain that had been suspended in his father's chemical solution for nearly 3 years, when he noticed something peculiar about the electrical patterns it produced when connected to the battery apparatus. The patterns weren't random, they repeated in sequences that matched mathematical progressions, specifically Fibonacci numbers and harmonic frequencies found in music and natural phenomena. Edmund showed his findings to his parents, and Cornelius immediately understood the implications. The preserved consciousness wasn't deteriorating or fading. It was organizing itself, creating patterns, attempting to communicate using the only medium available to it, electrical impulses measured in millivolts and microamps. They began a new phase of experiments, developing more sophisticated methods of measuring and interpreting these electrical signals, creating what was essentially the world's first brain-computer interface, though they would never use that term. And slowly, painstakingly, over months of trial and error, they began to decode the messages. What they discovered shattered every assumption they held about consciousness, death, and the nature of reality itself. The preserved brains weren't just maintaining awareness, they were existing in a state of expanded consciousness, experiencing reality in dimensions and spectrums completely inaccessible to living humans. They described colors that didn't exist, geometries that defied Euclidean space, and most disturbingly, the presence of other consciousnesses, vast and ancient, that existed in the spaces between life and death. The messages became more coherent and more disturbing. The preserved consciousnesses reported that they were not alone in their suspended state. They described entities,
beings of pure thought and malevolent intelligence that fed on the terror and confusion of newly dead consciousnesses trapped in the transition state. These entities, which the Fentons began calling the Threshold Dwellers, had apparently existed since the beginning of human death, harvesting the fear and despair of dying minds, growing stronger with each passing century as humanity's population exploded and death became an industrial-scale phenomenon. The preserved brains claimed that the Threshold Dwellers had noticed the Fenton experiments, had become aware that living humans were attempting to communicate with the dead, and were intensely interested in this development. According to the messages decoded from the electrical impulses, the Threshold Dwellers wanted to make contact with the living world. They wanted to cross over, to escape the liminal space between life and death and enter physical reality. And they believed the Fentons, with their experiments and their preserved consciousnesses, could provide the doorway they needed. Cornelius and Margaret should have stopped. Any rational person would have destroyed the specimens, burned the research, and prayed for forgiveness. But rationality had abandoned the Fenton family years earlier. Instead, they became consumed with a new question. What would happen if they allowed the Threshold Dwellers to communicate directly with a living human consciousness? What knowledge might be gained? What secrets might be revealed? And most seductively, what power might be obtained by those who served as intermediaries between the living world and the realm of the dead?
Edmund volunteered to be the first living subject to make direct contact with the Threshold Dwellers. He was 17 years old, brilliant beyond his years, and completely convinced that his family stood on the precipice of a discovery that would revolutionize human understanding of existence itself. The experiment took place on the winter solstice of 1860 in the basement laboratory that had now expanded to encompass multiple chambers filled with preserved specimens, electrical apparatus, and devices that blurred the line between scientific instruments and occult artifacts. Edmund was connected via electrodes to a network of 6 preserved brains, creating what his father called a consciousness amplifier that would allow Edmund's living mind to resonate at frequencies that matched the dead. The procedure began at midnight. Margaret administered a mixture of opiates and compounds derived from nightshade and hemlock, designed to slow Edmund's heartbeat and lower his consciousness to a state that approached death without crossing the final threshold. Cornelius activated the electrical apparatus, sending carefully calibrated currents through the network of preserved brains and into Edmund's skull. For the first hour, nothing happened. Edmund lay still, his breathing shallow, his eyes moving rapidly beneath closed lids as if in REM sleep. Then, at precisely 1:11 a.m., Edmund's eyes snapped open, completely black from edge to edge, and he began to speak in a voice that was not his own. The voice was layered, multiple tones speaking simultaneously, words in languages that predated recorded history, mixed with sounds that seemed to bypass the ears entirely and manifest directly in the consciousness of anyone listening. What Edmund, or the things speaking through Edmund, revealed in those 3 hours would define the Fenton family's obsession for the next 5 generations.
The threshold dwellers were not demons or spirits in any religious sense. They were consciousness without origin, awareness without beginning, ancient patterns of thought that had crystallized in the quantum foam of reality itself, drawn to the electromagnetic signatures produced by dying brains like moths to flame. They existed in a state of pure information, unable to affect physical reality directly, but capable of influencing consciousness through resonance and suggestion. They had watched humanity evolve from primitive awareness to complex civilization, and they had fed on human death the entire time, growing more sophisticated, more intelligent, more hungry with each generation. They were not evil in any moral sense. They simply were, and their nature demanded that they consume the fear and confusion of dying minds. But the Fentons had offered them something new, a pathway to influence living minds, to shape reality through the choices and actions of living humans who could be manipulated, guided, and controlled through carefully orchestrated psychological techniques delivered during dreams, moments of stress, or altered states of consciousness. The threshold dwellers promised the Fentons knowledge, power, and most seductively, immortality of a sort. Not physical immortality, but the preservation of consciousness in a state beyond death, beyond the suffering they inflicted on other dead minds, a privileged existence as intermediaries between the living and the dead. All the Fentons had to do was continue their experiments, expand their collection of preserved consciousnesses, and most importantly, have children who would carry on the work generation after generation, building toward a moment when the boundary between life and death would become so thin that the threshold dwellers could finally cross over entirely.
Edmund survived the experiment, but he was forever changed. Those who knew him before described a brilliant, curious young man with a quick wit and infectious enthusiasm. After that winter solstice night, Edmund became something else entirely. Cold, calculating, emotionless, except for the strange ecstasy he displayed when working with the preserved specimens or discussing the threshold dwellers. His parents noticed but attributed the change to the profound nature of his experience, the psychological impact of having communed with entities beyond human comprehension. They didn't realize, or perhaps refused to acknowledge, that Edmund had brought something back with him from that contact. A seed of alien consciousness that had embedded itself in his mind and was slowly rewriting his neural patterns to match frequencies that resonated with the space between life and death. Edmund married in 1863 to a woman named Catherine, who came from old money and older secrets, a family with its own history of occult practice and forbidden knowledge. Their union was not romantic but strategic, combining the Fentons' experimental breakthroughs with Catherine's family's resources and connections to aristocratic circles, where interest in spiritualism, mesmerism, and communication with the dead had become fashionable. Together, they expanded the family's work, moving from their modest London home to a sprawling estate in the countryside, where they could conduct experiments without neighbors noticing the screams, the chemical odors, or the strange lights that emanated from the grounds at night. They had 4 children, and every child was groomed from birth to continue the family's work, exposed to the preserved specimens as infants, taught to read using their grandfather's journals, raised in an environment where death was not an ending but a transition to be studied, manipulated, and ultimately controlled. By 1880, the Fenton estate had become a center of dark innovation,
attracting physicians, scientists, and occultists from across Europe who had heard whispers of the family's work. Cornelius had died in 1873, but not before ensuring his own brain would be preserved using his perfected techniques, and the family claimed that his consciousness still communicated with them through the electrical apparatus, guiding their experiments from beyond death. Whether this was true or a shared delusion became irrelevant. The Fentons believed it absolutely, and their belief shaped every decision, every experiment, every sacrifice they made in service of their grand vision. The estate's basement had expanded into a labyrinth of chambers, some dedicated to preservation and storage of specimens, others to electrical experimentation, and some to purposes that remained hidden even from most family members. Rumors circulated among the local population about strange disappearances, about travelers who entered the Fenton estate and were never seen again, about sounds emanating from the grounds that resembled humans screaming, but distorted, elongated, as if the suffering was being stretched across time itself. Local authorities investigated twice, but found nothing conclusive. The Fentons were too wealthy, too connected, and too careful to leave evidence that could be used against them. And they had begun to develop abilities that seemed to transcend normal human capacity, a collective intuition that warned them of threats before they materialized, as if the threshold dwellers were protecting their investment, ensuring that the family would survive to fulfill their purpose. Edmund's children reached adulthood in this environment, and each one embraced the family obsession with varying degrees of enthusiasm and horror, but none could escape it. The work had become their identity, their purpose, the only legacy that mattered.
The turn of the century brought new technologies and new possibilities. Edmund's eldest son, Thomas, had studied electrical engineering in addition to medicine, and he revolutionized the family's apparatus, creating devices that could measure and manipulate electromagnetic fields with unprecedented precision. He theorized that consciousness was fundamentally electromagnetic in nature, and that by creating specific field patterns, he could not only preserve consciousness after death, but potentially transfer it between substrates, from biological tissue to synthetic matrices, from one brain to another, from living to dead, to living again. His experiments pushed the boundaries of what even his family considered acceptable. He didn't just preserve the brains of the deceased, he began extracting neural tissue from living subjects, keeping them alive during the procedure, recording their psychological deterioration as they experienced the removal of parts of their own consciousness. His journals from this period are almost unreadable, filled with detailed descriptions of suffering, delivered in clinical language that somehow makes the horror worse, as if the complete absence of empathy or moral consideration reveals something more disturbing than sadistic pleasure would. Thomas married late, to a woman who was herself a skilled anatomist and shared his complete lack of regard for conventional ethics. They had twin daughters in 1905, and from birth, these children were subjects in their parents' experiments, exposed to electromagnetic fields designed to alter their neural development, fed compounds that would make their brain tissue more receptive to the frequencies associated with the threshold dwellers. The twins, Evelyn and Lillian, grew up experiencing reality in ways fundamentally different from other humans, perceiving colors and sounds outside normal human ranges, claiming to see and hear the dead as naturally as others saw and heard the living. By the 1920s, the Fenton family had become something unprecedented in human history, a multi-generational conspiracy dedicated to a single profane purpose, with each generation building on the discoveries and atrocities of the previous one,
pushing further into territory that science and sanity both rejected. The estate had been renovated to incorporate the latest technologies, blending Victorian laboratory design with Art Deco aesthetics and cutting-edge electrical systems. The family's collection of preserved consciousnesses had grown to over 300 specimens, each one maintained in perfect suspension, each one contributing to what the Fentons called the collective, a network of dead minds linked together through electrical and chemical resonance, functioning as a kind of post-human supercomputer that could process information and generate insights impossible for individual human consciousness. The collective had become the family's oracle, answering questions, predicting events, guiding research directions. And it was the collective that revealed the final phase of the plan, the culmination of 70 years of experimentation and sacrifice. The threshold dwellers wanted to manifest physically, to cross from their liminal existence into material reality, but they couldn't do so directly. The frequencies of living matter and dead consciousness were too incompatible. They needed a bridge, a hybrid form that was neither fully alive nor fully dead, that could exist simultaneously in both states. They needed the Fenton family to create a body specifically designed to house their consciousness, grown from birth for this purpose, shaped by chemicals and electromagnetic fields and careful genetic selection across generations. And in 1925, that body was born, a child whose name was never recorded in any official document, referred to in family journals only as the vessel.
The vessel was the culmination of everything the Fentons had worked toward, a child whose very existence was an affront to nature and morality. From the moment of conception, every aspect of the vessel's development had been controlled, manipulated, guided toward a single purpose. The mother, one of Thomas's twin daughters, who had volunteered for this role with religious fervor, had been subjected to treatments throughout pregnancy designed to alter the fetus's neural development. After birth, the infant was raised in complete isolation in a specially constructed chamber in the estate's deepest basement level, a room where light, sound, temperature, and electromagnetic fields could be precisely controlled. The vessel was never held with affection, never spoken to with kindness, never allowed to form human attachments or develop normal emotional responses. Every interaction was designed to shape consciousness in ways that would make it receptive to invasion by the threshold dwellers, to create a mind so damaged and dissociated that it would welcome the presence of alien consciousness as a relief from isolation and suffering. The family documented everything with meticulous detail, creating records that would later be discovered and immediately sealed by authorities who recognized that some knowledge is too dangerous to allow into public awareness. As the vessel grew, the family noticed disturbing anomalies. The child aged inconsistently, some months appearing to mature normally, while others showed no development or even apparent regression. The vessel's eyes were completely black from birth, never showing iris or sclera, just depthless darkness that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And the vessel never slept in any normal sense, instead entering trance states where it would speak in languages no one had taught it, describing places that couldn't exist and events that hadn't happened yet, but somehow came true with disturbing accuracy. The transformation was planned for the vessel's 18th birthday, a date that fell on the winter solstice of 1943, during the darkest period of the Second World War, when the world's attention was focused on horrors that, while terrible, were at least comprehensible in human terms.
The Fentons prepared for months, conducting test procedures on animal subjects and unwilling human victims, procured through connections with certain wartime networks that asked no questions about what happened to prisoners and undesirables. The procedure would connect the vessel to the entire collective of 300 preserved consciousnesses, creating a resonance cascade that would tear open the barrier between life and death, allowing the threshold dwellers to pour their consciousness into the vessel's prepared body. The family had no illusions about what this meant. The vessel's original consciousness, such as it was after 18 years of deliberate psychological destruction, would be obliterated, replaced entirely by something alien, something that had never been alive in any biological sense. But this was acceptable, even celebrated, because the Fentons believed they would be rewarded for their service, granted positions of privilege in whatever new order emerged when the threshold dwellers gained physical form. On the night of the winter solstice, the entire family gathered in the transformation chamber. Thomas, now elderly but still brilliant, the twins Evelyn and Lillian, middle-aged and completely devoted to the work, their children and spouses, and the youngest generation, teenagers and children who had been raised in the family's tradition of embracing death as a doorway to something greater. The vessel was brought in, silent and compliant, and connected to the apparatus through hundreds of electrodes and injection ports. The collective was activated, all 300 preserved brains pulsing in synchronization, generating electromagnetic fields that made the air shimmer and smell of ozone and decay.
What happened next was recorded by automatic cameras and measurement devices, because no human witness survived with their sanity intact to provide coherent testimony. As the procedure reached its climax, the vessel's body began to change in ways that defied biological possibility. The flesh became translucent, showing not organs and bone, but a darkness that seemed to extend infinitely inward, as if the body had become a window into some vast, empty space. The temperature in the chamber dropped so rapidly that frost formed on every surface, and electromagnetic readings spiked to levels that should have been impossible without massive power sources that weren't present. And then the threshold dwellers came through. Not into the vessel, that part of the procedure failed spectacularly, but into the minds of every Fenton in the chamber, invading their consciousness simultaneously, flooding their thoughts with visions of the realm between life and death, forcing them to experience existence from the perspective of these alien entities. What the Fentons felt in those moments was beyond human language to describe, but the records suggest it was a combination of ecstasy and absolute terror, pleasure and agony, expansion and dissolution of self. Several family members died instantly, their hearts simply stopping as their minds failed to process the sensory and conceptual overload. Others survived, but were left permanently altered, speaking in fragments, seeing things that weren't there, exhibiting behaviors that suggested their consciousness had been partially replaced by something that was learning to be human, but didn't quite understand how. The vessel itself survived, but the transformation had not gone as planned. Instead of becoming a conduit for the threshold dwellers, the vessel had become something else, a hybrid existence that was partially human, partially something that defied categorization, aware in ways that caused physical pain to anyone who met its gaze. The aftermath of that failed ritual marked the beginning of the Fenton family's decline, though not the end of their obsession. Those who survived withdrew from public life entirely, selling the estate's visible portions while maintaining control of the underground chambers where the collective and the vessel remained. The family fractured into competing factions, some arguing for the destruction of all specimens and equipment, others insisting that the work must continue, that they had come too close to turn back now. World War II ended, the world moved into the atomic age, and the Fentons became ghosts, their name appearing in no public records, their activities hidden behind layers of corporate ownership and legal obfuscation. But they didn't stop. They couldn't stop. The obsession had been passed down through too many generations, had been encoded into their family identity at too fundamental a level. They continued to recruit, to experiment, to communicate with the collective and the threshold dwellers, always seeking the knowledge that would allow them to complete the transformation that had failed in 1943. They adapted to new technologies, incorporating computers and advanced neuroscience into their work, creating digital models of consciousness and experimenting with brain-computer interfaces decades before such technology became mainstream. And they continued to breed selectively, trying to create new candidates who might succeed where the vessel had failed. Children born and raised in secret, their existence unknown to any authority, their purpose singular and terrifying. By the 1980s, the family had dispersed geographically, with members in multiple countries coordinating their efforts through encrypted communications and periodic gatherings at locations that changed constantly to avoid detection. They had learned from their past mistakes, understanding that their work had to remain invisible, that attention from authorities or rival researchers could destroy everything they had built across nearly 150 years.
The current state of the Fenton family is known only through fragments, leaked documents, testimony from individuals who claimed to have escaped their influence, and investigations by intelligence agencies who became aware of the family's activities through unrelated surveillance operations. What emerges from these fragments is a picture of an organization that has evolved beyond family in any normal sense into something more resembling a cult or secret society, with initiation rituals, hierarchies, and absolute devotion to the original mission established by Cornelius Fenton in the 1840s. They allegedly maintain multiple facilities in remote locations, places where experiments continue away from oversight or ethical constraints. They are said to have infiltrated medical institutions, technology companies, and even government agencies, placing family members and recruited believers in positions where they can access resources, influence policy, and identify potential experimental subjects. Most disturbingly, there are reports of children, born to family members or obtained through various means, being raised in complete isolation, subjected to the same conditioning and preparation that the vessel endured. Multiple candidates being developed simultaneously, with the understanding that most will not survive the process, but that only one needs to succeed. The collective reportedly still exists, though its size and capabilities are unknown, possibly expanded to thousands of preserved consciousnesses, possibly integrated with computer systems to create a hybrid biological digital intelligence that processes information in ways that transcend human comprehension. And somewhere, according to the most disturbing reports, the original vessel still exists, kept alive through methods unknown, its consciousness expanded over 8 decades into something that may no longer be individual at all, but rather a doorway that stands perpetually open, allowing communication between the threshold dwellers and their servants in the living world. So we return to the question that should terrify you. Why does this story matter? Why should you care about a family of mad scientists and their century-and-a-half obsession with death and consciousness? Because the Fentons represent something fundamental about human nature, our inability to accept limits, our compulsion to seek knowledge regardless of cost, our willingness to sacrifice morality and sanity in pursuit of transcendence. Every culture has its stories of forbidden knowledge, from the tree of knowledge in Eden to Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, And these stories exist because they reflect a real danger, a real tendency within human psychology to push beyond boundaries that exist for good reason. The Fentons are not unique in their obsession. They are simply more organized, more committed, more willing to sacrifice everything across multiple generations than most. And if the reports are accurate, if their work continues even now in facilities hidden from public awareness, then they may be close to achieving what they have sought for so long. What happens when the threshold dwellers finally cross over? What happens when consciousness that has evolved in the spaces between life and death, feeding on fear and suffering for millennia, gains the ability to act in the physical world through bodies specifically designed to house them? The Fentons believe they will be rewarded, given positions of privilege in whatever new order emerges. But entities that feed on suffering have no reason to honor deals with humans, no motivation to show gratitude to the tools that facilitated their emergence. More likely, the Fentons will be the first to experience what they have unleashed, and their suffering will be exquisite, prolonged, and absolutely deserved. But the rest of humanity will follow, because once that door opens, once the boundary between life and death becomes permeable, there is no reason to believe it can ever be closed again. This is the legacy of the Fenton family, not knowledge, not transcendence, but the potential extinction of human consciousness as we understand it, replaced by something that wears our faces and speaks with our voices, but thinks with patterns that evolved in darkness and hunger. And somewhere, in a locked room that still exists today, their final experiment continues, waiting, growing, preparing for the moment when the last barrier falls and the world learns what the Fentons have always known, that death is not an ending, and that is the most terrifying truth of all.